The drill sergeant's whistle cut through the humid Georgia morning like a blade. Recruits scrambled across Fort Benning's training grounds, their boots pounding against red clay that had witnessed decades of soldiers in the making. But today, all eyes were on one particular obstacle course record that had stood untouched for 7 years. A seemingly impossible time of 4 minutes and 23 seconds set by Captain Marcus Rodriguez before his deployment to Afghanistan. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Standing at the starting line, Sergeant Riley Parker adjusted her gear with steady hands, ignoring the snickers echoing from the crowd of male soldiers gathered to watch. At 24, she was compact but powerfully built, with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun and green eyes that burned with quiet determination. The betting pool had already started, not on whether she'd beat the record, but on how spectacularly she'd fail trying. "Daddy's little princess thinks she can play soldier," muttered Corporal Jake Harrison, loud enough for his buddies to hear, but quiet enough to avoid official reprimand. "My money says she doesn't even finish." Riley had heard variations of this taunt her entire military career. Growing up as Senator William Parker's daughter in suburban Virginia, she'd been surrounded by privilege, private schools, debutante balls, summers at Martha's Vineyard. Her father's political connections could have secured her any position she wanted, yet she'd chosen infantry. The decision had baffled Washington's elite social circles and infuriated her father, who'd expected her to follow a more traditional path into law or politics. The obstacle course stretched before her like a gauntlet designed by someone who understood pain intimately. 37 individual challenges spanning nearly 2 miles of unforgiving terrain. It began with a 30-foot rope climb, followed by tire runs, wall scaling, low crawls through mud pits, balance beams over water obstacles, and finished with a grueling sprint carrying a 60-pound pack. Riley's journey to this moment had begun 3 years earlier at Officer Candidate School, where her fellow candidates had initially dismissed her as a politician's daughter playing dress-up. She remembered her first week vividly, how Cadet Thompson had sarcastically offered to carry her pack, how others had whispered about her connections whenever she excelled at something. The assumption was always the same. Anything she accomplished was handed to her, not earned. But Riley Parker had a secret weapon that none of them knew about. Growing up in her father's shadow had taught her to work twice as hard for half the recognition. While her classmates at Georgetown Prep had been attending charity galas, she'd been training with Olympic-level coaches her father had hired, not for social climbing, but because she'd begged him to let her pursue competitive athletics. Swimming, rock climbing, martial arts, distance running, she'd absorbed everything, driven by a need to prove she was more than just a pretty face with the right last name. Her first real test had come during a training exercise in South Carolina swamplands. Lieutenant Colonel Davis had paired her with Sergeant First Class Mike Rodriguez, no relation to the record holder, a decorated veteran who'd made his skepticism about female soldiers abundantly clear. The mission was a 3-day survival and recognition exercise through some of the most challenging terrain the military had to offer. Rodriguez had started the exercise by setting a punishing pace, clearly expecting the senator's daughter to tap out within hours. Instead, Riley had matched him step for step through snake-infested marshes and thick forest undergrowth. When their radio died on day 2, leaving them without communication or GPS, she'd navigated using stars and terrain features her grandfather, a World War II veteran, had taught her during childhood camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. By the final day, Rodriguez's attitude had shifted completely. He'd watched her fashion water purification systems from field gear, set snares that actually caught food, and maintain operational security that would have impressed Special Forces instructors. When they'd emerged from the swamp exactly on schedule, he'd pulled her aside with something approaching respect in his weathered face. "I was wrong about you, Parker," he'd admitted gruffly, "but that just makes you one good soldier. The rest of these knuckleheads are going to take more convincing." The convincing had come in increments. During urban warfare training in mock Middle Eastern villages, Riley had demonstrated an uncanny ability to read situations and adapt tactics on the fly. Her language skills, she spoke fluent Arabic and Pashto, learned during college summer spent in diplomatic missions, had proven invaluable during cultural sensitivity exercises. But it was her performance in combat scenarios that really started turning heads. There had been an incident during live fire exercises when Corporal Williams had taken shrapnel from a training round malfunction. While others hesitated, Riley had moved without thinking, applying battlefield medicine techniques and coordinating medical evacuation under simulated enemy fire. Her actions had saved Williams from what could have been a career-ending injury, yet somehow the story that circulated afterward focused more on her father's influence than her competence. The pattern had continued through advanced infantry training. When she'd scored expert marksman on every weapon system, whispers suggested private tutors. When she'd excelled at tactical planning exercises, credit went to her expensive education rather than natural aptitude. Every achievement was diminished, every success questioned. The breaking point had come 6 months ago, during a joint training exercise with elite units from multiple branches. The scenario involved a complex urban assault requiring precise coordination between ground forces, air support, and intelligence assets. Riley had been assigned as a squad leader, a position that would normally go to someone with more experience, but personnel shortages had created the opportunity. Her squad had included some of the most challenging personalities in the unit. Sergeant Torres, a combat veteran with 3 tours who resented taking orders from anyone without similar experience. Corporal Mitchell, whose family had military roots going back 5 generations and who'd made his feelings about political appointments clear. And Private First Class Johnson, barely 19 and desperate to prove himself to his more experienced squadmates. The mission brief had been deliberately complex, a simulated hostage rescue in an urban environment with multiple variables designed to test leadership under pressure. Intelligence reports were incomplete and contradictory, rules of engagement were restrictive, and civilian casualties would result in immediate mission failure. Riley had spent hours studying the operational area, identifying potential approaches and contingency plans for various scenarios. She'd consulted with each squad member individually, drawing on their specific expertise and experience. Torres knew urban combat, Mitchell understood explosive ordnance disposal, and Johnson had recently completed advanced communications training. When the exercise began, everything that could go wrong did. Initial reconnaissance revealed the target building's layout was different from intelligence reports. Simulated enemy resistance was heavier than expected. Civilian actors complicated movement patterns. Radio communications were jammed intermittently, forcing reliance on hand signals and predetermined protocols. But Riley's preparation paid off. She'd anticipated communication difficulties and established backup systems. Her route planning had included multiple approaches based on different scenarios. Most importantly, she'd earned enough trust from her squad that they followed her lead even when orders seemed counterintuitive. The breakthrough moment had come when Torres, pinned down by simulated enemy fire, had radioed for assistance. Standard protocol would have been to call for backup and wait for reinforcements. Instead, Riley had recognized that the enemy position was designed to channel attackers into a killing zone. She'd ordered Mitchell to create a diversion while she and Johnson flanked through a route that required scaling a 3-story building and crossing rooftops under time pressure. The maneuver had worked perfectly. They'd neutralized the threat, rescued the hostages, and completed the exercise with 0 simulated casualties in record time. Exercise controllers had been so impressed they'd requested detailed after-action reports for use in training future officers. Yet somehow, the accomplishment had been overshadowed by speculation about whether her father's Senate committee positions had influenced the exercise design. The whispers followed her everywhere: political connections, special treatment, daddy's money buying success. Now, standing at the obstacle course starting line with hundreds of eyes watching, Riley felt the familiar burn of motivation that came from being underestimated. The morning sun was climbing higher, promising another scorching Georgia day. Sweat already beaded on her forehead despite the early hour. She'd been training for this moment for months, studying video footage of previous record attempts, analyzing each obstacle's specific challenges, and developing techniques that maximized efficiency while minimizing energy expenditure. Her training regimen had been brutal, daily sessions that pushed her body beyond conventional limits, combined with mental preparation that involved visualizing every possible scenario. The rope climb that opened the course was 30 feet of pure arm and core strength. Most soldiers approached it with brute force, burning energy they'd need later. Riley had developed a technique that used leg positioning and body mechanics to distribute the load more efficiently. She'd practiced it thousands of times until the movement became automatic. Behind the rope climb waited tire runs that tested agility and coordination. Then came the dreaded wall scaling sequence, a series of increasingly difficult vertical challenges that had ended many previous attempts. The mud pits and low crawls would test endurance and mental toughness, while the balance beams over water obstacles required precision under pressure. But it was the final sprint with the 60-pound pack that separated contenders from record holders. By that point, most soldiers were running on empty, their form deteriorating with each step. Riley had studied biomechanics and developed a carrying technique that maintained efficiency even under extreme fatigue. The betting against her had grown more creative as word spread through the base. Some soldiers wagered she wouldn't complete the course at all. Others bet on specific obstacles where they expected her to fail. A few optimistic bets suggested she might finish respectably, but nobody, absolutely nobody, was betting she'd threaten the record. Sergeant Major Williams approached the starting line, his weathered face neutral but his eyes sharp with professional interest. At 52, he'd overseen thousands of obstacle course attempts and had developed an eye for potential. Riley's preparation had impressed him, but potential meant nothing without execution. "Parker," he called out, in his gravelly voice that carried the authority of 3 decades in uniform, "are you ready for this?" Riley nodded, her focus narrowing to the challenges ahead. The crowd noise faded to background static as she entered the mental zone she'd cultivated through years of competition. This was the moment everything had been building toward, not just months of training, but years of proving herself in a world that seemed to see her nothing more than a privileged senator's daughter playing soldier. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The whistle was about to blow, and Riley Parker was about to show everyone exactly what Daddy's little princess could do. The whistle's sharp blast cut through the morning air, and Riley exploded from the starting line with explosive precision. Her first 3 steps were calculated, building momentum while maintaining perfect form. The crowd's jeers faded into white noise as muscle memory took control. The rope stretched about her like a vertical highway to hell. Riley hit it at full speed, her hands finding the exact grip position she'd practiced 10,000 times. Instead of the traditional hand-over-hand climb that burned out most soldiers' forearms, she employed a technique borrowed from competitive rock climbing, using her legs as anchors while her core did most of the work. 15 seconds. She crested the top in 15 seconds, already 3 seconds ahead of the record pace. Below, Corporal Harrison's smirk faltered as he checked his stopwatch. "Lucky start," he muttered, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Riley dropped from the rope with controlled precision, rolling forward to absorb impact while transitioning directly into the tire run. 37 tires arranged in a zigzag pattern, each one a twisted ankle waiting to happen. Most soldiers approached them with choppy, uneven steps. Riley flowed through them like water, her center of gravity low and steady, each foot placement deliberate and efficient. She'd spent weeks studying the tire spacing, memorizing the pattern until she could navigate it blindfolded. Her legs moved in perfect rhythm, left, right, center, outside, a dance choreographed for speed and safety. Sergeant Major Williams leaned forward, his professional interest fully engaged. In 30 years, he'd never seen anyone move through the tires that smoothly. The girl wasn't just fast, she was technically flawless. The wall scaling sequence loomed ahead, 5 barriers of increasing height, from 6 feet to 12 feet, each designed to break spirits and bodies. The first wall was psychological warfare, easy enough that soldiers gained false confidence before hitting the real challenges. Riley approached the six-footer at a dead sprint, planting her left foot halfway up and using momentum to carry her over the top. No wasted motion, no pause, no hesitation. She landed running and immediately attacked the 8-footer with the same fluid aggression. The 10-footer required different tactics. Here, upper body strength mattered. Riley jumped, caught the top edge with both hands, and executed a muscle-up that would have impressed gymnastic judges. Her shoulders burned, but she trained for this specific moment, building the exact muscle groups needed for this obstacle. Behind her, the crowd had gone strangely quiet. Even the betting pool had stopped taking action as soldiers realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The 12-footer was the course's first real killer. Smooth concrete, no handholds, just pure height and the need to generate enough vertical leap to reach the top edge. Soldiers who made it this far often spent precious minutes figuring out their approach, burning energy they couldn't afford to lose. Riley had studied every successful attempt on video. She'd identified a slight imperfection in the wall surface, a tiny ledge created by the concrete forms during construction. Invisible unless you knew where to look, but enough to provide a momentary foothold for someone with the right technique. She hit the wall at maximum speed, planted her right foot on the hidden ledge, and launched herself upward with every ounce of explosive power in her legs. Her fingertips caught the top edge with millimeters to spare. The crowd gasped as she hung momentarily, then pulled herself up and over with movements that looked effortless but required strength most people couldn't comprehend. 2 minutes 47 seconds elapsed. She was now 43 seconds ahead of record pace, and the hardest obstacles still lay ahead. The mud pit stretched before her like a brown lake of misery, 50 yards of knee-deep sludge with barbed wire strung 18 inches above the surface. The only way through was to low crawl on elbows and knees, staying below the wire while fighting through mud that sucked at equipment and energy. This where technique mattered more than strength. Riley had practiced in similar conditions, learning to move like a salamander. Smooth, efficient, never fighting the mud but working with it. She kept her center of gravity as low as possible while maintaining forward momentum. The mud was cold despite the warming day, shocking her system as it soaked through her uniform. Barbed wire caught at her equipment, trying to snare her pack straps and weapon. Private Johnson, watching from the sidelines, shook his head in amazement. "She's not even slowing down," he whispered to Torres, who stood beside him with growing respect in his weathered face. "That's because she knows what she's doing," Torres replied. "Look at her technique. That's not luck or privilege, that's pure skill." Riley emerged from the mud pit looking like a creature from a swamp monster movie, but her pace hadn't decreased. Mud clung to every surface of her gear, adding weight and drag, but she'd anticipated this and adjusted her hydration and energy management accordingly. The balance beam section tested a different kind of courage. 7 beams of varying heights stretched over water obstacles ranging from 3 feet deep to 8 feet deep. Fall from the low beams and you got wet and embarrassed. Fall from the high beams and you risked serious injury. Most soldiers approached these obstacles with visible tension, moving cautiously to avoid slipping. Riley attacked them with controlled aggression, trusting her balance and accepting calculated risks to maintain speed. She'd spent countless hours on gymnastics beams as a child, developing proprioception and spatial awareness that served her perfectly now. The first beam was routine, 8 inches wide, 4 feet above shallow water. Riley crossed it in seconds, her arms spread for balance, but her movements confident and quick. The second beam was narrower and higher, but she maintained the same aggressive pace. The third beam was the psychological killer, only 6 inches wide, 12 feet above deep water, with a 30-degree curve in the middle designed to throw off balance and depth perception. Riley had failed this obstacle during training more than any other, but she'd also learned from each failure. She stepped onto the beam with absolute focus, her world narrowing to the 6 inches of metal beneath her feet. The curve approached, and she adjusted her body position slightly, compensating for the changed geometry. Her inner ear tracked every micro-movement, making constant corrections to keep her centered. Halfway across, a gust of wind caught her pack and tried to push her sideways. For one terrifying moment, she teetered on the edge of disaster. The crowd held its collective breath as she fought to regain balance, her arms windmilling as she battled physics and momentum. Then she was through, landing on the far platform with both feet solid. The crowd erupted in surprised cheers, even from soldiers who'd been betting against her. Respect was creeping into voices that had been full of mockery minutes earlier. 4 minutes, 12 seconds. Riley was now 18 seconds faster than record pace, but the obstacles ahead were specifically designed to break down soldiers who had pushed too hard in the early stages. The cargo net climb was 50 feet of rope mesh that swayed and shifted with every movement. Soldiers who attacked it aggressively often found themselves fighting the net's motion instead of working with it. Riley had learned to read the net's rhythm, timing her movements to coincide with its natural oscillations. She climbed steadily, her breathing controlled despite the accumulated fatigue. Each hand placement was deliberate, each foot position calculated to maximize efficiency. The net tried to betray her with sudden shifts and slack spots, but she adjusted instinctively, her body reading the rope's language fluently. At the top, she paused for exactly 3 seconds to catch her breath and assess the final challenges. Below her, the obstacle course stretched toward the finish line like a gauntlet designed by someone who understood human limitations intimately. The final sprint loomed ahead, 800 yards with a 60-pound pack after already covering nearly 2 miles of obstacles that had pushed her body to its limits. This was where records live or die, where the difference between good soldiers and exceptional ones revealed itself. Riley adjusted her pack straps, feeling the weight settle across her shoulders like an old familiar burden. Her legs were screaming, her lungs burned, and every muscle fiber begged for rest. But somewhere deep in her core, the fire that had driven her through 3 years of proving herself still burned bright. The crowd had swelled as word spread across the base. Soldiers emerged from barracks and training facilities to witness what was becoming legendary. Even the skeptics were leaning forward, caught up in the drama of a record attempt that nobody had expected to be competitive. Sergeant Major Williams checked his stopwatch one more time, hardly believing the numbers he was seeing. In 30 years of military service, he'd learned to spot exceptional soldiers. But this was something beyond exceptional. This was transcendent. Riley descended the cargo net with controlled urgency, her muscles screaming protests that she systematically ignored. The final phase of the course stretched before her like a test designed by sadists. 800 yards of varied terrain, with a 60-pound pack that felt like it was filled with concrete blocks. The path twisted through 3 distinct sections, each engineered to exploit different weaknesses. First came the sand pit, 200 yards of loose, shifting ground that turned every step into a battle against physics. Lesser soldiers slowed to a cautious jog here, afraid of stumbling. Riley maintained her aggressive tempo, trusting her conditioning and technique to carry her through. Her breathing had shifted into a rhythm she'd perfected during marathon training, deep, controlled cycles that maximized oxygen intake while preventing the hyperventilation that destroyed so many athletes. The pack bounced against her back with metronomic precision, its weight distributed across her frame through careful adjustment and years of load-bearing experience. Behind her, the crowd had grown into a small army. Word was spreading through Fort Benning like wildfire. Senator Parker's daughter was not just attempting the obstacle course record, she was demolishing it. Soldiers abandoned training exercises to witness history in the making. Even officers who should have been maintaining professional distance found themselves drawn to the spectacle. Colonel Reeves emerged from the command building, his dress uniform immaculate despite the early hour. At 58, he'd seen enough military careers to recognize genuine excellence when it appeared. The reports reaching his office had been so extraordinary, he'd decided to observe personally. "What's her current time?" he asked Sergeant Major Williams, who stood transfixed by the performance unfolding before them. 4 minutes, 51 seconds, sir. She's 28 seconds ahead of Rodriguez's record pace, and she hasn't even started breathing hard. The colonel raised his binoculars, studying Riley's form as she powered through the sandpit. Her technique was flawless, short, quick steps that prevented her feet from sinking deep, arms pumping in perfect counterbalance to her leg movements. More importantly, her mental state appeared unshakable. No panic, no desperation, just cold professionalism applied to an impossible challenge. "Son of a bitch," the colonel muttered under his breath. "She might actually do this." Riley burst from the sandpit and attacked the rocky incline without pause. This section had ended more record attempts than any other obstacle. Loose stones that shifted underfoot, irregular surfaces that demanded constant attention, and a grade steep enough to burn out leg muscles already pushed beyond normal limits. She'd walked this section dozens of times during her preparation, memorizing every treacherous spot and identifying the optimal path through the chaos. While other soldiers picked their way carefully up the slope, Riley followed a route she'd mapped in her mind. Stepping stones of stable rocks that formed an efficient line to the summit. Her pack felt like it was gaining weight with each step, the straps cutting into her shoulders despite careful padding. Sweat stung her eyes, and her legs were beginning to feel the accumulated damage from 2 miles of punishment. But Riley had learned something during her years of competition that most soldiers never discovered: the difference between pain that warns of injury and pain that was simply the price of excellence. 20 feet from the summit, disaster nearly struck. A rock she'd counted on for support shifted under her weight, sending loose stones cascading down the slope. For a heart-stopping moment, she teetered on the edge of a fall that would have ended not just her record attempt, but possibly her career. The crowd gasped as one, hundreds of voices creating a sound like air escaping from a massive balloon. Even hardened veterans found themselves holding their breath as Riley fought to regain her balance on the treacherous slope. But she didn't fall. Years of rock climbing and mountaineering kicked in automatically, her body adjusting to the changed conditions without conscious thought. She shifted her weight, found new footing, and continued climbing as if nothing had happened. The recovery was so smooth that observers might have thought it was planned. "Jesus Christ," whispered Corporal Harrison, his earlier mockery completely forgotten. "She's not human." Riley crested the incline with 5 minutes and 38 seconds on the clock. The mathematics were becoming impossible to ignore. She was 45 seconds ahead of record pace with only the final sprint remaining. But mathematics meant nothing if her body couldn't deliver when it mattered most. The home stretch looked innocent compared to the obstacles behind her. Just 300 yards of flat ground between her and immortality. But Riley knew better. She'd studied video of every failed record attempt, and the pattern was always the same. Soldiers reached this point believing the hardest part was over, only to discover that their bodies had nothing left to give. The pack felt like it had doubled in weight. Her shoulders were on fire from the straps, her legs were screaming, and her lungs burned with each breath. This was the moment when technique mattered more than strength, when mental toughness separated champions from also-rans. Riley had prepared for this exact scenario. During her training, she'd practiced running with progressively heavier loads until 60 pounds felt manageable. More importantly, she'd conditioned her mind to function when her body wanted to quit. The techniques came from her childhood swimming competitions, where she'd learned to maintain perfect form even when oxygen debt made her vision blur. She settled into the rhythm she'd perfected over months of preparation, a sustainable pace that pushed her limits without crossing into the danger zone where muscles seized up and coordination failed. The crowd had gone completely silent, as if noise might somehow interfere with the miracle unfolding before them. Even the skeptics were caught up in the drama, their cynicism overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of what they were witnessing. Sergeant Torres found himself clenching his fists unconsciously, willing Riley forward with every step. The combat veteran had seen courage under fire, had witnessed acts of heroism that earned bronze stars and Purple Hearts. But there was something about this moment that transcended normal definitions of bravery. A young woman refusing to accept limitations that others had imposed on her. 100 yards from the finish line, Riley's form began to deteriorate. The perfect posture that had carried her through 2 miles of obstacles started to crack under the accumulated strain. Her shoulders sagged slightly under the pack's weight, her breathing became more labored, and her stride lost some of its mechanical precision. But she didn't slow down. If anything, she found another gear that nobody knew she possessed. This was the moment when champions revealed themselves. Not when everything was going perfectly, but when perfection became impossible and willpower became the only currency that mattered. 50 yards out, the finish line seemed to pulse in her vision like a mirage. The crowd noise returned as soldiers began cheering despite themselves, caught up in the raw drama of human potential pushing against physical limitations. Riley's internal monologue had quieted to a single imperative: keep moving forward. Step after step after step, each one a small victory against gravity and exhaustion and the voices that had told her she wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't soldier enough. 25 yards. The clock showed 6 minutes and 48 seconds. If she could maintain her pace for 15 more seconds, she would shatter a record that everyone had believed was untouchable. But 15 seconds had never felt longer. Her vision tunneled to the finish line ahead, everything else fading to gray periphery. The pack straps felt like they were cutting through her shoulders, her legs moved like they belonged to someone else, and her lungs couldn't seem to process oxygen fast enough to meet her body's demands. Yet she continued forward, driven by something deeper than training or technique or even raw determination. This wasn't just about beating a record anymore. It was about proving that excellence couldn't be bought or inherited or gifted. It had to be earned, one painful step at a time. 10 yards from the finish line, with the record within reach, Riley Parker discovered exactly what she was made of. Riley's boots crossed the finish line at exactly 6 minutes and 57 seconds, her body collapsing forward in a controlled fall that she somehow managed to turn into a stumbling walk. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 hardened soldiers standing in complete shock as the reality of what they'd witnessed settled into their minds. She had done it. Not only had she beaten Captain Rodriguez's seemingly untouchable record, she had obliterated it by 1 minute and 26 seconds. The first sound came from Private Johnson, a single explosive "holy shit" that seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the crowd. Then pandemonium erupted. Soldiers who had been betting against her rushed forward, their disbelief transforming into something approaching awe. Even Corporal Harrison found himself applauding, his earlier mockery completely forgotten in the face of unprecedented achievement. Riley stood bent over, hands on her knees, fighting to control her breathing while her body processed what she had just accomplished. Every muscle screamed, her lungs burned, and sweat poured from her face like rain. But underneath the physical exhaustion, she felt something she had never experienced before: the quiet satisfaction of proving herself beyond any possible doubt. Sergeant Major Williams approached slowly, his stopwatch still in his trembling hands. In 30 years of military service, he had never seen anything like this performance. The technical precision, the mental toughness, the sheer audacity of attacking a 7-year-old record with such overwhelming force. It challenged everything he thought he knew about human limitations. "Parker," he said, his gravelly voice thick with emotion he was struggling to conceal. "That was the most extraordinary display of soldiering I have ever witnessed." Colonel Reeves pushed through the crowd. His usually composed expression revealed genuine amazement. He had come expecting to witness a respectable attempt, maybe even a competitive showing. Instead, he had watched a complete redefinition of what was possible on this course. "Sergeant Parker," he said formally, though his voice carried undertones of profound respect, "I believe congratulations are in order. That performance will be talked about for decades." Riley straightened up slowly, her body still processing the massive physiological debt she had incurred. Her uniform was soaked through with sweat, mud still clung to her gear from the early obstacles, and her face was flushed red from exertion. She looked like she had been through a war, which in many ways she had. "Thank you, sir," she managed between deep breaths. "It was an honor to represent the unit." The crowd was growing larger by the minute as word spread throughout Fort Benning. Soldiers emerged from buildings across the base, drawn by rumors that seemed too extraordinary to believe. The betting pool had collapsed entirely, with nobody quite sure how to process wagers made on the assumption that failure was inevitable. But in the immediate aftermath of her triumph, Riley found herself thinking not about records or recognition, but about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years of proving herself, 3 years of having every achievement questioned and every success diminished. Today had changed that calculus permanently. Sergeant Torres pushed through the crowd, his weathered face showing emotions he rarely allowed others to see. The combat veteran had initially been skeptical about serving under a politician's daughter, but Riley's performance during their joint training exercise had begun changing his perspective. This morning's display had completed that transformation. "Ma'am," he said, using the respectful address that acknowledged her officer status, "I owe you an apology. We all do." Riley shook her head, still fighting to regulate her breathing. "No apologies necessary, Sergeant. I understand the skepticism. I would have felt the same way." But Torres wasn't finished. "With respect, man, that's not true. What you just did, that wasn't privilege or connections or political influence. That was pure warrior spirit, and every soldier here witnessed it." The crowd murmured agreement. Their earlier cynicism completely evaporated in the face of undeniable excellence. These were men and women who understood physical courage, who had been tested in training and combat, who knew the difference between genuine achievement and manufactured success. What they had witnessed was authentic in a way that couldn't be faked or purchased. Captain Sandra Walsh arrived breathless from across the base, having run from her office when news reached the administrative buildings. As the highest-ranking female officer on post, she had followed Riley's career with particular interest, hoping to see her succeed but privately fearing that failure might set back other women's opportunities. "Sergeant Parker," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and amazement, "I don't think you understand what you've accomplished here. This isn't just about beating a record. You've changed perceptions that have existed for generations." Riley was beginning to understand the broader implications of her achievement. The obstacle course record was significant within military circles, but the manner of her victory, the complete dominance, the technical perfection, the mental toughness displayed under extreme pressure would resonate far beyond Fort Benning. Her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. Word was already spreading beyond the base, carried by social media and unofficial networks that connected military installations worldwide. Within hours, video footage would be circulating through Pentagon corridors and reaching military academies where her performance would become required viewing. But Riley's thoughts were focused on simpler things. She thought about her grandfather, the World War II veteran who had taught her navigation skills during childhood camping trips. He had died 2 years ago, never knowing whether his granddaughter would succeed in her chosen profession. She wished he could have been here to see this moment. She thought about Lieutenant Colonel Davis, who had paired her with Sergeant Rodriguez during swamp training, expecting her to fail but giving her the opportunity to prove herself anyway. She thought about every instructor who had pushed her harder, every fellow soldier who had initially doubted her capabilities, every challenge that had seemed designed to break her spirit. Most of all, she thought about her father, Senator William Parker, who had never understood her decision to join the military, but had eventually come to support it. He would hear about this achievement through official channels, and for the first time in years, he would know beyond doubt that his daughter had chosen her path wisely. Medical personnel arrived to conduct mandatory post-exercise evaluations, checking for signs of heat exhaustion or injury from the intense physical demand she had just endured. Riley submitted to their examinations patiently, though every part of her body was screaming for rest and recovery. Her core temperature was elevated but within acceptable ranges. Her heart rate was beginning to normalize. Blood pressure readings showed the expected spikes from extreme exertion, but nothing dangerous. Remarkably, she showed no signs of the dehydration or electrolyte imbalance that typically accompanied such intense physical output. "Ma'am," said the medic conducting her evaluation, "I need to ask, what was your training regimen for this attempt? Because physiologically speaking, what you just accomplished shouldn't have been possible." Riley smiled through her exhaustion. "Just good old-fashioned preparation, Doc. I studied every aspect of this course and trained specifically for each challenge. There's no secret formula, just work harder than everyone else thinks is reasonable." But even as she said it, Riley knew that wasn't completely true. Yes, her training had been exceptional. Yes, her preparation had been meticulous. But something else had carried her through those final 100 yards when her body was screaming for mercy. Something that couldn't be taught or trained or purchased. The absolute refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose. As the immediate celebration began to wind down and reality started reasserting itself, Riley realized that this moment represented both an ending and a beginning. She had proven everything she needed to prove about her capabilities and worthiness. But she had also set a new standard for herself, one that would require her to continue growing and proving and pushing boundaries. The record was just numbers on a stopwatch. The real victory was deeper and more lasting. The knowledge that she had discovered exactly what she was capable of when everything was on the line. 3 hours later, Riley sat in the base infirmary, her body wrapped in cooling towels while IV fluid slowly replenished what her record-breaking run had depleted. The medical staff had insisted on extended observation, partly for her safety, but mostly because they couldn't quite believe what they had witnessed and wanted to document every aspect of her recovery. Dr. Patricia Hansen, Fort Benning's chief sports medicine physician, reviewed Riley's post-exercise diagnostics with growing fascination. The blood work revealed lactate levels that should have left her unconscious, yet Riley remained alert and coherent. Her muscle enzyme markers indicated damage consistent with ultramarathon competition, but her neurological responses were completely normal. "Sergeant Parker," Dr. Hansen said, pulling up a chair beside the examination bed, "I've been studying exercise physiology for 20 years, and your performance today challenges several accepted scientific principles. How do you explain maintaining that level of output when your body should have been shutting down?" Riley considered the question carefully. "I think it comes down to preparation, ma'am. Physical preparation, obviously, but mental preparation might have been more important. I spent months visualizing every possible scenario, including complete physical breakdown. When it happened, my mind was ready." But even Riley knew that didn't fully explain what had occurred. In those final 100 yards, when her body was beyond exhaustion, something else had taken over. A part of her consciousness that was separate from physical sensation, separate from pain or fatigue or the overwhelming urge to quit. Outside the infirmary, Fort Benning was buzzing with activity unlike anything seen in recent memory. Riley's achievement had spread through military networks with viral intensity. Phone calls were coming in from Pentagon officials, military academy commandants, and special forces recruitment offices. News crews were requesting access to the base, drawn by a story that seemed to embody everything the military hoped to represent. Colonel Reeves found himself fielding inquiries from generals he hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting to know more about the young woman who had just redefined human performance parameters. The Pentagon's Director of Physical Fitness Standards had already called twice, suggesting that Riley's techniques be studied and potentially incorporated into standard training protocols. In the Base Communications Center, Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, no relation to the previous record holder, was fielding media requests that seemed to multiply by the hour. CNN wanted an exclusive interview. Fox Sports was asking about documentary rights. The Pentagon's Public Affairs Office was requesting immediate briefings on the incident. "Sir," she reported to Colonel Reeves, "we've got 17 different news organizations asking for access, 3 documentary crews requesting permission to film, and something called the Military Athletes Foundation wanting to sponsor Sergeant Parker for competitive events." The colonel rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a tension headache. Military bases were designed to handle training accidents, security breaches, and logistical emergencies. They weren't equipped for media circuses triggered by extraordinary individual achievement. Meanwhile, in the barracks where Riley's unit was housed, the dynamic had shifted completely. Soldiers who had been placing bets against her 12 hours earlier were now competing to share stories about training with her, serving under her command, or witnessing her preparation for the record attempt. Private Johnson found himself surrounded by soldiers from other units, all wanting to hear firsthand accounts of Riley's leadership during their joint training exercises. The shy 19-year-old was discovering that proximity to greatness carried its own social currency. "She never made it about proving anyone wrong," he explained to a group of fascinated listeners. "During that urban warfare exercise, when everything was going sideways, she just focused on the mission. No drama, no speeches about earning respect. She just did the job better than anyone thought possible." Corporal Mitchell, whose family's 5-generation military tradition had initially made him resistant to taking orders from a politician's daughter, was having more complex reactions to the day's events. His great-grandfather had served in World War II, his grandfather in Korea, his father in Vietnam, and he himself had deployed twice to Afghanistan. None of them had ever witnessed anything comparable to Riley's performance. "My dad always said that real soldiers reveal themselves under pressure," he told Sergeant Torres during their afternoon break. "Today, I learned what he meant. Everything I thought I knew about leadership and toughness, she just redefined all of it." Torres nodded thoughtfully. The combat veteran was processing his own revelation about the nature of excellence and how it could emerge from unexpected sources. His initial skepticism about Riley had been based on decades of experience with soldiers who talked big but couldn't deliver when tested. Today had forced him to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about capability and character. Back in the infirmary, Riley was fielding phone calls from family members who had heard about her achievement through military networks. Her father, Senator Parker, called from Washington with a mixture of pride and bewilderment in his voice. "Riley," he said, his political composure cracking slightly, "I just got off the phone with General Morrison. He says what you did today was unprecedented in modern military history. I have to admit, I never fully understood why you chose this path, but after today—"
"Dad," Riley interrupted gently, "I chose this path because I needed to know what I was capable of. Today, I found out." The conversation with her father revealed something she hadn't fully recognized until this moment. Her military service hadn't been about rejecting his world of politics and privilege. It had been about discovering her own authentic identity, separate from inherited advantages. The obstacle course record was just external confirmation of internal growth that had been years in the making. Her mother called next, tears evident in her voice despite her attempts to maintain composure. Catherine Parker had watched her daughter transform from a privileged teenager into a confident military officer, but she had never quite understood the drive that pushed Riley toward increasingly difficult challenges. "Sweetheart," she said, "when you were little, you used to tell me you wanted to be strong enough to help people who couldn't help themselves. I think I finally understand what you meant." As evening approached, Riley was cleared for release from the infirmary with strict instructions for recovery and follow-up monitoring. Her body was already beginning the adaptation process, but the physiological stress from her record attempt would require careful management over the coming weeks. Walking back to the barracks, she was struck by how different everything felt despite looking exactly the same. The buildings, the training grounds, the paths between facilities, all identical to 12 hours earlier, yet somehow transformed by the knowledge of what had occurred. Soldiers she passed offered respectful nods and quiet congratulations, but there was something deeper in their expressions. They weren't just acknowledging her achievement, they were recognizing that she had pushed the boundaries of what they thought possible within their shared profession. In her quarters, Riley found her desk covered with messages, cards, and small gifts left by fellow soldiers. Most were simple expressions of respect and admiration, but a few stood out for their personal significance. Sergeant Major Williams had left a handwritten note. "In 30 years, I've seen courage, dedication, and excellence in many forms. Today, you showed me a new definition of all three. It has been an honor to serve with you. From Sergeant Torres, ma'am, you've taught this old soldier that leadership isn't about where you come from, it's about where you're willing to go when everything is on the line. Thank you for the lesson. Even Corporal Harrison, whose early mockery had stung more than Riley cared to admit, had left a simple message. I was wrong about everything that mattered. You've earned my respect in ways I didn't know were possible. But the note that moved her most came from an unexpected source. Captain Rodriguez's widow, who lived in base family housing and had heard about the day's events. Her late husband's record had stood as a memorial to his dedication and capability. Now it had been broken by someone who honored what it represented while pushing beyond its limitations. Dear Sergeant Parker, the note read, Marcus would have been proud to see his record broken by someone who approached it with such respect and preparation. You didn't just beat his time, you honored his memory by showing what's possible when excellence meets opportunity. Thank you for proving that some achievements are stepping stones rather than monuments. As Riley prepared for bed, her body still aching from the morning's exertion, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in the span of a few hours. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, media attention, increased scrutiny, higher expectations from superiors and peers alike. But tonight, she was simply a soldier who had discovered exactly what she was made of when everything was on the line. And that knowledge would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. 2 weeks after her record-breaking performance, Riley found herself sitting across from General Patricia Blackwood in the Pentagon's E-Ring, feeling distinctly underdressed despite wearing her best dress uniform. The 4-star general commanded the Army's Training and Doctrine Command and was responsible for developing physical fitness standards across all branches of service. Sergeant Parker, General Blackwood began, her steel-gray eyes studying Riley with the intensity of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Your performance at Fort Benning has created quite a stir in military circles. More importantly, it raised questions about our current understanding of human performance limitations. The meeting had been arranged after Riley's achievement generated unprecedented interest from military researchers, sports scientists, and training specialists worldwide. Video analysis of her obstacle course run had been dissected frame by frame, revealing techniques and strategies that challenged conventional wisdom about optimal performance under extreme conditions. Ma'am, Riley responded carefully, I was simply applying techniques I'd developed through extensive preparation and training. I don't believe I did anything that couldn't be replicated with proper conditioning and mental preparation.
General Blackwood smiled slightly, the expression softening her usually stern features. Sergeant, I've been reviewing performance data from every major military training facility for the past 20 years. What you accomplished wasn't just exceptional, it was statistically impossible according to our current models of human athletic capability. The implications of Riley's achievement had rippled through military training establishments with surprising speed. The Army Physical Fitness Research Institute had requested complete documentation of her training regimen. The Special Operations Command was quietly investigating whether her techniques could enhance selection processes for elite units. Even NASA had expressed interest, wondering if her mental conditioning methods might benefit astronaut training programs. Dr. Michael Chen, the Pentagon's Director of Human Performance Research, entered the conference room carrying thick folders of data analysis. His team had spent 2 weeks studying every aspect of Riley's performance, from her biomechanical efficiency to her psychological preparation methods. General, Sergeant Parker, he nodded to both women before opening his primary folder. Our analysis has identified 17 specific technique modifications that contributed to her performance advantage. More significantly, we've documented mental conditioning approaches that appear to override normal physiological limitations during extreme exertion. Riley shifted uncomfortably as Dr. Chen outlined his findings. She had agreed to cooperate with the research, understanding that her achievement might benefit other soldiers' training. But being dissected like a laboratory specimen felt invasive and somehow diminished the personal significance of her accomplishment.
The most fascinating aspect, Dr. Chen continued, is how she maintained decision-making capability and motor function precision even when her body was experiencing severe physiological stress. Traditional sports science suggests that cognitive function should have deteriorated significantly during the final phase of her run. General Blackwood leaned forward with renewed interest. Are you saying her mental training methods allowed her to bypass normal human limitations? Not bypass, exactly. More like she developed coping mechanisms that allowed her to function effectively despite those limitations. It's similar to what we see in certain special forces operators, but achieved through completely different training methods. The conversation was interrupted by Colonel James Patterson from the Army's Special Operations Recruitment Division. His presence at the meeting suggested that Riley's performance had attracted attention from the military's most elite units. "Sergeant Parker," Colonel Patterson said without preamble, "I'll be direct. Several Special Operations commands have expressed interest in your potential for advanced training programs. Your performance demonstrated exactly the kind of mental toughness and physical capability we look for in Special Operations candidates." Riley felt a familiar flutter of excitement mixed with apprehension. Special Forces selection had always seemed like a distant possibility, something she might pursue years in the future after gaining more experience. Now it was being offered as an immediate option, a fast-track opportunity that could transform her career trajectory overnight. "Sir," she replied carefully, "I'm honored by the interest, but I feel I still have much to learn in my current role. I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of responsibility." Colonel Patterson exchanged glances with General Blackwood before responding. "Sergeant, readiness isn't always about time in service or conventional preparation. Sometimes it's about demonstrated capability under extreme pressure. Your obstacle course performance showed both, in ways that can't be taught in a classroom." The meeting continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from potential research collaborations to career development opportunities that Riley had never imagined possible. By the time she left the Pentagon, her head was spinning with possibilities that seemed thrilling and overwhelming. Back at Fort Benning, the atmosphere had gradually returned to normal training routines, though Riley's achievement remained a constant undercurrent in daily conversations. New recruits arriving at the base were shown video footage of her record run as part of their orientation, establishing it as the new gold standard for what was possible with proper preparation and mental toughness. The obstacle course itself had become something of a pilgrimage site for soldiers from other installations. Training units requested permission to attempt the course, hoping to measure themselves against the new benchmark Riley had established. None came close to her time, but several achieved personal bests that suggested her techniques were indeed transferable to other athletes. Sergeant Major Williams had been tasked with documenting Riley's training methods for potential incorporation into standard physical fitness protocols. The gruff veteran found himself in the unusual position of analyzing mental conditioning techniques alongside traditional strength and endurance programs. "Parker," he said during one of their interview sessions, "I've been training soldiers for 30 years, and I'm still trying to understand how you maintain that pace through the final sprint. What exactly were you thinking about when your body should have been shutting down?" Riley considered the question carefully, as she had dozens of times over the past weeks. "Honestly, Sergeant Major, I wasn't thinking about much of anything. I'd visualized that scenario so many times during training that the response became automatic. When conscious thought became impossible, muscle memory and mental conditioning took over." But there was more to it than that. Something she hadn't articulated to any of the researchers or analysts who had studied her performance. In those final moments, when physical sensation became irrelevant, she had experienced something approaching transcendence, a state where willpower became the only reality that mattered. The media attention had been intense, but carefully managed by the base's public affairs office. Riley had given interviews to military publications and mainstream media outlets, always emphasizing that her achievement represented preparation and dedication rather than exceptional natural talent. A particularly memorable interview with a major television network had focused on her background as a senator's daughter who chose military service over conventional privilege. The interviewer had clearly expected her to criticize her upbringing or distance herself from her family's political connections. Instead, Riley had surprised everyone by crediting her privileged background with providing opportunities that enhanced her military service. The private tutors who taught her languages, the Olympic-level coaching that developed her athletic foundation, even the social expectations that taught her to perform under scrutiny, all had contributed to her success as a soldier. Privilege becomes a problem when it's used as a substitute for effort, she had explained to the interviewer. But when it's combined with genuine dedication and hard work, it can become a force multiplier for achievement. I had advantages that most people don't have, and I feel obligated to use them in service of something larger than myself. The interview had generated considerable discussion about class, privilege, and military service, with commentators debating whether Riley's background had helped or hindered her development as a soldier. But within military circles, the conversation was simpler. She had proven her capabilities beyond any possible doubt, and her background was irrelevant compared to her performance. 3 weeks after her record-breaking run, Riley received orders that would change the trajectory of her military career. She had been selected for the Army's Advanced Leadership Program, a fast-track development initiative reserved for officers identified as having exceptional potential for senior command positions. The program would take her to Fort Leavenworth for 6 months of intensive training in strategic planning, large unit leadership, and military policy development. It was an opportunity typically reserved for officers with significantly more experience, but her obstacle course achievement had apparently accelerated the timeline for her professional development. As she prepared for the transition to Fort Leavenworth, Riley reflected on how completely her life had changed since that morning when she had stood at the obstacle course starting line listening to soldiers bet against her success. The physical achievement had been significant, but the psychological transformation was even more profound. She no longer felt the need to prove herself in the same desperate way that had driven her for 3 years. The constant internal pressure to demonstrate worthiness had been replaced by quiet confidence in her capabilities and clear understanding of her goals within military service. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that excellence wasn't about overcoming limitations. It was about discovering that many limitations were self-imposed illusions that dissolve when confronted with sufficient preparation and unwavering determination. The little girl who had once been dismissed as Daddy's little princess was gone, replaced by a soldier who understood exactly what she was capable of when everything was on the line. 5 years later, Lieutenant Colonel Riley Parker stood before the United States Military Academy at West Point, addressing a class of first-year cadets who looked impossibly young and eager. Her dress uniform bore the decorations of a distinguished career that had exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own: Bronze Star with Valor, Combat Action Badge, Ranger Tab, and the coveted Special Forces Tab that represented 18 months of the most demanding military training in existence. "Today, I want to talk about limitations," she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from leading soldiers in combat operations across 3 different theaters. Not the ones imposed by physics, but the ones we accept because someone else decided they were reasonable. The cadets listened with the focused attention reserved for speakers whose credentials commanded respect. Riley's story had become legendary within military circles. The senator's daughter who transformed herself into one of the Army's most effective special operations officers. But the obstacle course record was just the beginning of a career that had redefined what was possible for women in combat roles. After completing the Advanced Leadership Program at Fort Leavenworth, Riley had volunteered for Special Forces Assessment and Selection, becoming one of only 12 women to successfully complete the grueling course in its first year of gender integration. Her performance had been exceptional, finishing 3rd overall in a class of 47 candidates, most of whom had years more experience than her 26 years. Her first deployment as a Special Forces officer had been to Syria, where her language skills and cultural training proved invaluable in building relationships with local coalition forces. She had led joint operations that successfully disrupted terrorist supply networks while minimizing civilian casualties, earning recognition from both American and Allied commanders. The second deployment to Afghanistan had tested her leadership under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Her team had been assigned to a remote firebase in Helmand Province, conducting counterinsurgency operations in territory that had been contested for decades. The mission parameters were complex: train Afghan National Army units, conduct intelligence-gathering operations, and maintain security in a region where Taliban influence remained strong.
3 months into the deployment, her firebase had come under sustained attack from a well-coordinated enemy force that outnumbered the American and Afghan defenders by more than 3 to 1. The battle had lasted 14 hours, with Riley coordinating defensive operations while simultaneously calling in air support and managing casualty evacuations. Her actions during the engagement had saved 17 lives, both American and Afghan, while successfully repelling an attack that could have resulted in the firebase being overrun. The Bronze Star with Valor citation had specifically mentioned her exceptional leadership under fire and tactical brilliance that prevented catastrophic losses while maintaining operational effectiveness. But Riley knew that the medals and commendations were just external recognition of internal growth that had begun years earlier on an obstacle course at Fort Benning. Every challenge since then had been preparation for moments when lives depended on her ability to function effectively despite impossible circumstances. "The morning I broke that obstacle course record," she continued, scanning the faces of cadets who represented the Army's future leadership, "I learned something that changed how I approached every challenge afterward. I discovered that the difference between possible and impossible is usually just a matter of preparation and willpower." She paused, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "But more importantly, I learned that proving yourself to others is less significant than discovering what you're truly capable of. The external validation is temporary. The self-knowledge is permanent." Among the cadets listening was Catherine Martinez, whose own journey to West Point had been complicated by family expectations and social pressures that seemed designed to limit her ambitions. Her parents had wanted her to pursue medicine or law, traditional paths for successful Hispanic families in their Texas community. The military had seemed like an incomprehensible choice to relatives who measured success through conventional professional achievement. After Riley's presentation, Catherine approached with questions that revealed her own struggles with identity and belonging. "Ma'am," she asked hesitantly, "how do you handle people who think you don't belong, who assume your achievements are somehow artificial?" Riley smiled, recognizing something of her younger self in the cadet's earnest expression. "Cadet Martinez, the most important audience for your achievements is you. Other people's opinions about your worthiness are ultimately irrelevant if you know you've earned your place through genuine effort and preparation." The conversation continued for several minutes, covering topics that ranged from practical training advice to philosophical questions about purpose and identity within military service. Riley found herself remembering similar conversations she'd had with mentors during her own development, recognizing how crucial such guidance had been in her own journey. Later that evening, Riley walked alone across West Point's grounds, her footsteps echoing against stone buildings that had witnessed generations of military leaders in training. The Hudson River flowed past ancient ramparts, carrying away the day's concerns while reflecting lights from the academy's windows. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sergeant Torres, now a first sergeant at Fort Campbell, where he was training the next generation of infantry soldiers. His message was brief but meaningful. "Saw your speech online. You're still teaching this old soldier new things about leadership and perseverance. Thank you for showing us what excellence looks like." Similar messages had been arriving throughout the day from soldiers she'd served with at various stages of her career. The network of relationships she'd built stretched across multiple branches of service and included some of the military's most respected leaders. But the connections that meant most with soldiers like Torres, who had witnessed her transformation from unproven newcomer to combat-tested leader. Riley's parents had attended her promotion ceremony to lieutenant colonel 6 months earlier, finally understanding the path their daughter had chosen.
Senator Parker's pride was evident as he watched his daughter receive recognition for achievements that had nothing to do with political connections or inherited privilege. "I never understood why you needed to prove yourself so completely," he had told her after the ceremony, "but watching you today, I realized that the proving was never for us. It was for you." Her mother had been more direct, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her daughter in full dress uniform. "You've become exactly who you were meant to be," she whispered. "I just wish it hadn't taken me so long to see it." Now, 5 years after that transformative morning at Fort Benning, Riley was preparing for her next assignment, command of a Special Forces battalion, making her one of the youngest officers ever selected for such responsibility. The position would involve leading over 500 elite soldiers across multiple operational theaters, requiring skills that went far beyond individual achievement. But the foundation for that leadership had been established on an obstacle course where she had discovered that limitations were often just unchallenged assumptions. Every subsequent challenge, from special forces training to combat operations to the complex responsibilities of senior command, had built upon that fundamental realization. The obstacle course record still stood, though several soldiers had come within 30 seconds of matching it. Riley hoped someone would eventually break it, understanding that progress required each generation to push beyond the achievements of their predecessors. What couldn't be replicated was the internal transformation that had occurred during those 6 minutes and 57 seconds. The young woman who had been dismissed as Daddy's little princess had discovered something unbreakable within herself. The knowledge that excellence was possible for anyone willing to pay the price in preparation and determination. As she walked back toward her quarters, Riley reflected on the journey that had brought her from privileged uncertainty to confident leadership. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow and contribute and push boundaries that others considered fixed. But tonight, she was simply a soldier who had learned that the only real limitations were the ones you accepted for yourself. And that knowledge would guide her through whatever impossible things lay ahead. The little princess was gone, replaced by a warrior who understood exactly what she was capable of when everything was on the line. And there was no limit to how far that understanding could take her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.